This is the corrections video for Alfred's Essentials of Music Theory, Lesson 54. This is about figured bass and chord symbols. Both figured bass and chord symbols are shorthand so that we don't have to write out every note that is actually in a chord. About 500 years ago, when figured bass was developed, you would only see the bottom note of the chord and then this symbol right here. It tells you which, these numbers here tell you the interval above the bottom note that you should have. So this is a sixth and this is a fourth. That's why we have 6/4. And in the key of C, which it tells us we're in the key of C, this is a 1 chord because it starts on C. The chord is built around C. We know that we're not in root position because we don't have our snowman. We know that we have moved twice because this G up here would get us back to root position, or this E coming down and C coming down would get us into snowman position. So we know that it's a second inversion. We've moved it twice. That tells us that C is the root of our chord and C is the first note of the C major scale. So that's why it's a 1 chord here. All right, let's go ahead and get all of our figured bass done, and then I'll go back and talk about how the chord symbols work. All right, so to get this chord back into snowman position, we need to take this note down to here. That tells us that we are going to be, that this is actually the root of our chord and that we're in a first inversion. So the name of that note is F, and F is the 4th note of the C scale, C, D, E, F. So this is a 4 chord. Now it asks us to do the rest of the figured bass. So we have our Roman numeral, now we need our figured bass. This distance is a 6th, and this distance is a 3rd. When we have a 6/3, we can write it like that, but we can even shorthand the shorthand and skip the 3 altogether. So a 4/6 chord. Next, we have another first inversion triad, and we're going to take this G down here to get it back in snowman position. And that tells us that this is a G chord. G is the 5th note of the C major scale, and we have the distance of a 6th and the distance of a 3rd. So this would be a 6/3, and we're going to shorthand the shorthand and skip the 3. Next, you can see that we have a second inversion triad. And in our second inversion triad, we would have needed to move this F down to here and this A down to here, making this an F chord. F, we already established, is the 4th note of the C major scale, but now our distances are a 6th and a 4th. So we have a 4/6/4 chord. Back in first inversion, this note comes down an octave to get into snowman position, and it's a C. C is the 1st note of the scale, and we have a distance of a 6th, and we have a distance of a 3rd. We're going to shorthand the shorthand and skip the 3rd. All right, this one starts on G, which is the 5th note of the scale, and it's in second inversion. So we have a 6th here and a 4th here. It's always, those intervals are always the intervals above the bass note, the bottom note. Okay, now for our chord symbols, all we have to do is what was the name of the chord, so the root of the chord. In this case, it was an F. And then what note is on the bottom? In this case, it's an A. Next, what was the name of the chord? It was a G. What note is on the bottom right now? A B. This again was an F chord, and what's on the bottom? A C. Now you can see, like, these are both F chords. They have all the same notes in them, but one has an A on the bottom and one has a C on the bottom. Next, we have a C chord with an E on the bottom. And lastly, we have a G chord with a D on the bottom. Okay, now we do basically the same thing for our 7 chords, except for we have even a little more shorthand that we have to learn. 7 chords follow a pattern. First position is 5-7, and then 6-5, 4-3, 2. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, now secretly, that last one is actually 4-2, but you can remember the pattern for root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion by counting backwards from 7. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2. All right, so we see here that we are in root position, which means that it is going to be a 7 chord. It's just going to have the 7 because it's in root position. And we have to figure out what note of the scale is our root of this chord. So we're in root position, so the bottom note is the root. In this case, it's G. G is the 5th note of the C major scale. So it's a 5-7 chord. Next, we need to get this back into our 4 tall snowman. So we're going to take this note right here and move it down. We can see that our seconds are in the first position, just like we learned about in the last lesson. And so that makes it a first inversion triad. And so we see that our first inversion triad uses the abbreviation 6-5. And when we take this top note down and put it on the bottom, we see that it's a G. So it's a 5-6-5 chord. And lastly, we have a third inversion triad because our second is on the bottom. So it's a third inversion triad, which is going to have the figured bass 4-2. And we can see that this right here is actually the root, which is G, which is the 5th note of our scale. So it's a 5-4-2 chord. Now, if you want to get really, really nitpicky, our figured bass is always talking about the intervals above the bass note of the chord. So technically, this 5-7 chord is a 5 because G is on the bottom in C, with a 7th above it, a 5th above it, and a 3rd above it. So technically, it's a 5-7-5-3. But those last two things are not necessary because the 7 implies all of them. The reason that this one is 6-5 is because this distance is a 6th, this distance is a 5th, and then this distance is a 3rd. So technically it's a 5-6-5-3, but we don't need the 3. Over here in 3rd position, this distance is a 6th, this distance is a 4th, and this distance is a 2nd. So the 6 is up here, but it is not necessary because all 7 chords have a 6th involved in them. Okay, same thing with this first one that they did for us. This is a 6th, this is a 4th, this is a 3rd. The 4 and the 3 are the ones that we use that are actually indicated because all of the 7 chords have a 6 in them. And we needed unique number combinations. Okay, now for our chord symbols, it's the exact same process that we had for our triads in that we know it's a G chord and it's a G7 chord because there are 4 notes involved. But then what is on the bottom? G. Now in root position, we don't have to have a slash. It's just like when you put something over itself in math, like so 4/4 in math, right? Like it reduces down. We don't need that other G on the bottom. Next, this is still a G7 chord, but now it has a B on the bottom. And lastly, still a G7 chord, but with an F on the bottom. So the top note in our slash chord is like a fraction. The top note in our chord symbol is the name of the chord, and the bottom note of the fraction is what is on the bottom.